You just did your taxes, or you avoided them for as long as possible. Either way, some part of your brain flinched at the word form. That flinch is older than you think. Your ancestors felt it too. But for them, it wasn't a headache. It was the beginning of the end of the most powerful empire the world had ever seen. You've probably heard that Rome fell because of barbarians at the gates. Swords, fire, chaos. That's the movie version. The real answer is far stranger. Rome didn't just fall to an army, it fell to a spreadsheet. Picture the Roman Empire at its peak. Roads stretching from Scotland to the Sahara. Cities with running water while most of the world still hauled buckets from rivers. An economy so vast it needed something to hold it together. That something was paperwork. Endless, grinding, suffocating paperwork. Every farmer, every merchant, every blacksmith in the empire eventually became a line item. The historian Peter Heather has spent decades studying how the late Roman state actually functioned day to day, and what he found wasn't glory. It was bureaucracy. Census officials walked from village to village counting people, animals, and acres of land. Not once, repeatedly. Because the emperor needed to know exactly how much he could squeeze out of you. Here's the part that stings. This wasn't corruption at the edges. This was the system working exactly as designed. Rome needed money for soldiers. Soldiers needed money to keep the peace. Keeping the peace let merchants trade. Trade got taxed, and the tax paid for more soldiers. A loop, a beautiful, brutal loop, until it wasn't beautiful anymore. By the 3rd century, that loop started spinning out of control. Emperors changed so fast, some of them didn't last a full year. Each new ruler needed cash immediately to pay the army that had just installed him and to outbid the next general already plotting his replacement. So they taxed harder, then they debased the currency, cutting the silver content of coins until a Roman denarius was basically decorative. Sound familiar? It should. Every time a government prints its way out of a problem today, it's running the exact same play from a 2,000-year-old rulebook. Now here's where it gets almost unbearably relatable. The Roman government didn't just tax you. It required you to prove you deserved to be taxed correctly. Landowners had to submit detailed declarations of their property. Miss a deadline, and local officials came looking. Underreport your olive trees, and you could lose your land, or worse. The economic historian Richard Duncan Jones spent years reconstructing these tax records from surviving inscriptions and papyri, and what emerges looks less like an ancient civilization and more like an audit that never, ever ends. Imagine explaining to a Roman farmer that 15 centuries later, people would still be sweating over receipts every spring. He would probably just nod. Some kinds of misery are apparently permanent. But taxes alone don't collapse an empire. What collapses an empire is what people do when they can't escape the tax anymore. And in late Rome, an entire class of small landowners made a choice that historians still argue about today. They gave up their freedom on purpose. Picture a family that owns a modest farm. The tax collector shows up every year, demanding a fixed amount regardless of the harvest. A bad drought doesn't lower the bill. It just makes the bill impossible. So what do? Increasingly, families in the 4th and 5th centuries did something extraordinary. They handed their land over to a wealthy patron, a large landowner with connections and private armed guards, in exchange for protection. The land stayed theirs to work. The freedom did not. This process, sometimes called patrocinium, quietly transferred power away from the imperial state and into private hands. The emperor still claimed to rule everything. In practice, huge stretches of the countryside answered to local strongmen instead. The historian Ward-Perkins has argued that this hollowing out was just as devastating as any invasion because it drained the empire's ability to fund itself from the inside, long before a single Goth crossed the Danube. Here's the twist that makes this whole story so uncomfortable. The barbarian invasions that finally broke the Western Empire in the 5th century didn't succeed because the invaders were unstoppable. Plenty of Roman armies had crushed larger forces in previous centuries. They succeeded because Rome could no longer reliably pay, feed, or organize the army it needed to stop them. The tax base had shrunk. The wealthy had sheltered their assets. The bureaucracy meant to fund defense was instead busy chasing smaller and smaller amounts of money from a population that had less and less left to give. Kyle Harper, a historian who has studied the empire's economic and even biological collapse, put it in terms that feel almost too modern. A state can survive plagues. A state can survive bad harvests. What it struggles to survive is losing the trust of the people paying for it. Once ordinary Romans stopped believing the system was worth funding, extracting money from them stopped being a policy problem and started being a war. Think about that for a second. The fall of Rome wasn't just soldiers losing battles. It was millions of quiet individual decisions. A farmer deciding it was safer to serve a local lord than pay imperial tax. A merchant deciding to hide profits rather than declare them. A city council deciding it was easier to let a wall crumble than fund its repair through another unpopular levy. None of these decisions looks dramatic on its own. Together, they are the sound of an empire quietly disconnecting from itself. And this is where the modern mirror gets almost too sharp to look at directly. Every large system you rely on today, your government, your workplace, your utility bill, runs on the same basic principle Rome discovered and then destroyed. People will fund a system as long as they believe it is fair and as long as they believe it works. The moment either belief cracks, people don't necessarily revolt. They quietly opt out. They take the informal payment. They skip the form. They find their own version of a private patron, whether that's an under-the-table job, a workaround, or simply disengagement from institutions that feel too broken to fix. You've probably felt a small version of this yourself. A rule that seems arbitrary. A fee that seems designed to punish rather than fund anything useful. A form that asks the same question 5 different ways. In that moment of quiet irritation, you're not so different from a Roman landowner staring at a census official, doing the mental math on whether compliance is even worth it anymore. Rome didn't collapse in a single dramatic afternoon. There was no meeting where officials announced the empire was over. There was just a long, slow accumulation of smaller and smaller tax rolls, weaker and weaker armies, and quieter trust, until one day the western half of the empire simply stopped being able to answer for itself. The last Western emperor was deposed in 476, and by most accounts, almost nobody at the time thought it was a particularly big deal. The paperwork, in a sense, had already stopped mattering years before. So the next time you feel that flinch, filling out a form, watching money disappear from a paycheck before you even see it, remember that you're not experiencing something new. You're experiencing the oldest tension in organized civilization. The tension between a system that needs your resources to survive and a person who needs to believe that system is worth feeding. Rome didn't fall to barbarians. Rome fell because, eventually, enough people quietly decided the form wasn't worth filling out anymore. And somewhere, underneath your own mild irritation at tax season, that same ancient calculation is still running, waiting to see whether you'll keep paying into a system or start looking for your own quiet way out.